Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. As the name suggests, this webinar will be focusing on securing identities in hybrid environments, and very much around the theme of we are better together doing it. And doing that and supporting that, we have Microsoft and Silverfort with us, who are key in being able to deliver that message on how exactly we're going to be securing identities in hybrid environments. I guess at the end of the next hour, what we hope that you will go away with is a very clear understanding of some of the effective identity and access management strategies that you can use, including maybe some best practices when it comes to safeguarding against cyber threats, in addition to meeting evolving compliance requirements such as DORA. So look, before we get started, let me just go through a little bit of housekeeping. We will be running through all the sessions, and I will touch on that agenda and the speakers in a second. There will be a chat function and also a Q&A section. So if you have any questions that crop up, please just do fire them through on that medium. And we've got a question and answer session at the end, so it's about 15 minutes before the close, and we'll run through any Q&A. If there's more than we can address in that, we will find a way to make sure that we draft something and come back post event. Okay, so who have we got with us today? So as I said, Silverfort and Microsoft are supporting us at ITC on this webinar today. To kick off the proceedings will be Ben Hanson. Ben is a senior security strategist and advisor from Microsoft, and he's going to be providing a brief overview of the hybrid work model and sharing some of the more common customer challenges that he has seen in his role at Microsoft in dealing with enterprises every day. Following that, we have welcome Jonathan Nativ, who's Director of Strategic Alliances at Silverfort, one of our key partners, and he will be touching on some simple strategies to look at how securing sensitive resource, and actually I believe he's got some demos to share with us today as well, so he'll be running through. And then last but not least, Jason Banks, who heads up our identity and access management practice at ITC. He'll conclude the session with how you can get started with a holistic approach, making technology from both Microsoft and Silverfort work better together for you. So again, I remind you at the end, question and answers, please do, as you see them or hear them, think of them, fire them in the Q&A or chat, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end. So without further ado, let me pass over to Ben, who will kick off the meat of the session. Thank you.
Great. Hi, all. I'm Ben. Hopefully everyone can see this slide okay, can hear me okay. Yeah, I'm going to share a little bit about some of the challenges. The team will talk a little bit more about some of the technical details in the Silverfort solution and the offerings around professional services and those kinds of things. But I work most often with the very large systemic banks that we have here in the UK and beyond. Identity and identity security transformation is, of course, a huge area of concern and questions for them. I want to start here with a picture of the zero trust ecosystem. Now, I know that the word zero trust makes you want to throw up a little bit. If I could be really honest, it makes me want to throw up a little bit. So if you take a step back, just zoom out and think about the principles. How did we get here? Okay, zoom out, forget about zero trust for a second. Think about the principles that gave rise to zero trust that are still really important in this conversation. So these three principles, certainly in our zero trust model, would be assume breach. So we know that organizations that operate from an assume breach perspective become more effective because they're not just focused on protection, they're focused on detection and response. They're not caught flat-footed when, not if, breaches happen. The second one would be least privilege. Of course, this is a very long-standing principle in security that has been around forever and will continue to be around forever, long after people stop saying things like zero trust. And then really the third one is validate explicitly. That's the third of the three. I actually don't like that name. I would say validate continually, or maybe extend it from validate continually explicitly to validate continually as well. And I want to kind of park on that one for a second because it's really going to come back to some of the things we're going to be talking about through this session and through the later sessions. We've always had this ability to kind of gatekeep access through our access control models. We make that decision on the front end. What's actually fundamentally changed, and the reason why I wanted to start in the zero trust conversation, is because what's fundamentally changed is the ability to continually assess and validate access based on conditions that are dynamic. So, of course, your identity risk changes, your device risk changes, other types of risk inputs can change. The policy engine, which is conditional access, of course, in our ecosystem, which is shown in the center of this diagram, is the piece that's able to take that information and then make very dynamic and continual access control decisions. And that's a really key part of the hybrid identity security conversation, because a big part of the value that a company like Silverfort provides is taking capabilities that exist in a native cloud identity, native identity provider such as Entra ID, and pulling that down into a space where those capabilities do not natively exist. And that's actually a really critical part of securing hybrid identity, not just your cloud identity. So one of the reasons why it's very difficult for organizations, the organizations that I work with, to secure the traditional Active Directory environment is because it's very hard to articulate and also to get your hands around from a governance perspective what the control plane, the full scope of what the control plane actually entails. So in the traditional Active Directory tiering model, which came out not too long after Active Directory came out in the year 2000, we refer to this top plane, control plane, as tier 0. It's really challenging for a number of different reasons for organizations to get their heads around identity security, because you have a number of things to consider. First of all, you've got physical access, something that we don't think about as much now in the cloud age, but is still totally relevant. You know, people who have physical access or access through something like a DRAC or an ILO, virtual access controller, we consider those effectively domain admins because they're on the tin. They can often bypass, for example, or disable encryption controls. Now you expand that further, you zoom out a little bit. We're talking about the scope of what constitutes tier 0 in an environment and why it's complex to secure traditional Active Directory. Now you've got all these other pieces around logical access, who controls the operating systems, the applications, the services. You expand that further, this box on the right, with a whole hodgepodge of built-in roles and groups that have elevated permissions that in some way or another can be used and are used by attackers to take control of Active Directory environments. And then those are kind of direct control paths. And then you've got the indirect control paths, which is, say, for example, you've got applications running on your domain controller. What are the upstream servers and applications that have control of those applications? Because this creates a chain of control. And then zoom out another step further. Which devices, administrators, for example, have control of the servers that have control of the servers that have control of the applications running on your domain controller. And so you see the full scope of what constitutes what we would consider the control plane, the tier 0 plane in a traditional Active Directory environment, gets very broad very fast. And that's very challenging to secure. Another one of the challenges that we have is that it's a number of organizations, actually most organizations I work with, they actually carve up the on-premises traditional Active Directory estate. It's a separate team from the team that tends to manage the cloud identity. And for lots of different reasons, I would like to propose that that's actually a terrible idea. You should not do that because the risk is actually shared across both. Here we have, in this example, privileged access users and non-privileged users accessing, you can see the box on the right, basically many of the same services. And what happens in many of our organizations is that we have what I would call shared identity-based intermediaries that sit astride both. These could be your fancy privileged access management tool. They could be synchronization servers. They could be federation servers. It's anything that sits astride both. And in the privileged access plane at the top and the user access plane at the bottom, you could substitute also cloud identity and on-premises identity. And in the hybrid conversation, what happens is we have these systems that sit astride both. And the problem with that is these create attack paths for attackers to either start in the cloud and pivot to on-prem to the traditional AD environment, or more commonly, actually start with the traditional AD environment and use those shared intermediaries as effectively access paths to pivot up to the cloud environment and take control of the cloud identity. And so what happens is we have carved up our environments internally, primarily around technical tools. So Active Directory is a separate technical tool from Entra ID. Different teams manage them, on-prem AD, on-prem identity, cloud identity. What I would like to propose is that when you have these shared intermediaries between both, they are not separate from a risk position, from a risk perspective for your business. That risk is shared. It's horizontal across both. Attackers exploit both. And yes, I understand that the technical skill is a little bit different, but we need to conceptualize. And the reason why organizations struggle with securing hybrid identities, they don't do this. We need to conceptualize identity as a horizontal, not built on technology verticals, a horizontal capability, cross-functional capability. And unless we align our ability to protect, detect, and respond across identity as a service, not carved up in technical towers, we continue to find gaps in between these technical towers that we create that attackers exploit. So the fundamental problem is that we end up, when we carve the world up into sort of these vertical technology towers, the problem is not that we don't have a strategy. The problem is that we have 17 strategies because the AD guys are doing their thing, the cloud team, the cloud platform team are doing their thing, the privileged access guys are doing their thing. And by the way, the privileged access guys on-prem are doing something different than the privileged access guys in the cloud. And that simply does not work. So if you want to take one thing away from this conversation, do not divide your identity estate up into technology verticals. You have to manage it as a horizontal end-to-end capability if you want to be successful. And the problem is if you don't, attackers will actually find these shared intermediaries between the two. These represent security control paths, security relationships. Remember John Lambert's famous quote that defenders tend to think in lists of controls, but attackers think in graphs. In other words, the security relationships between objects, which is how they traverse to get from point A to Z. And there's 100 different ways to get from point A to Z. And so my point is these shared intermediaries make it impossible for us to effectively secure either the privileged or the user planes or the cloud and on-prem identity planes unless we treat them as a homogeneous horizontal end-to-end service. Now, part of the challenge that we've had for quite a long time is that we haven't had a model that allows identity practitioners to conceptualize identity in the way that I just described it. So the traditional Active Directory model, there was some work, back in the day, people would take the traditional tiering model, tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, and try to apply that concept to cloud, and it doesn't work. Active Directory, the tiering AD model was created for a world that largely does not exist anymore. And by the strict interpretation rules of the traditional tiering model, the whole of cloud is actually tier 0, which is unsustainable. You can't manage it that way. So Microsoft created something that a lot of people, frankly, haven't seen, which is what I'm showing here. You can see it on the bottom left. It's a new access control model called the enterprise access model. And unlike the traditional tiered AD model, this takes into account all of the access scenarios that you have in a modern business that the traditional tiered model does not take account of. And so, as I mentioned, you want to have a model that will allow you to not only conceptualize, but to operationalize your security controls right the way across your estate, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. And so this is the way that, for example, Silverfort is enabling you to be able to take some of those capabilities that are really kind of cloud native capabilities and pull them into a traditional Active Directory environment. People that don't have that capability end up reinventing kind of ways to approach this. And I said some of this already, which is, they're really not separate from a risk perspective, so don't treat them that way. One of the things I wanted to show before I hand over, just as a practical example of this in the enterprise access model, I don't have time to unpack the enterprise access model. Feel free to ping me or the team. We're happy to kind of go into detail. But a key piece that people tend not to get right in the hybrid security conversation has to do with secure access paths. And so if you think about the principles that underpin some of these models, your access path from your user to your device, right the way through to administering privileged identity assets, in this case, for example, traditional Active Directory domain controllers, there cannot be a point anywhere on that line where a lower trust device is accessing and managing a higher trust device. That's a violation of really access control models that predate Active Directory, actually. It exposes them to lower trust tiers, which is how attackers find credentials on those devices from domain administrators and impersonate them and things like that. And the control plane concept, the privileged access plane concept in the enterprise access model allows you to not only have a consistent way to conceptualize identity and manage privileged identity assets in the cloud, it also allows you to reach back into non-cloud environments, such as shown here on the screen. So you can see, for example, you've got your data plane admins. If you're running, for example, domain controllers in the cloud, remember that from a cloud perspective, they're not special. They're just a collection of cloud resources. They are essentially data plane devices, even though they're highly privileged. And that exposes them to all kinds of downward control risks in the cloud environment that people don't think of. So what you have to have is an end-to-end secure privileged access management path. EAM enables this. You can see, for example, on this slide, the controls that you go through, privileged access workstation. So this is a clean keyboard. You still need this, even if you have a fancy PAM tool. Privileged identity management, Azure Bastion, which is a pivot point that allows you to access a device, in this case called Privileged Virtual Desktop, which is your jump-off point and your context switch to your Active Directory environment, and then being able to reach back into your Active Directory environment to manage those on-prem resources. And so this model can help you conceptualize of identity in a way that crosses your whole organization rather than carving it up into verticals. And this is really a good place for me to hand off, I think, to the rest of the team, because one of the challenges is that we've not had the ability to take some of those capabilities from the cloud that make cloud identity security a little bit easier and pull it into an environment that has sort of 25 years of business process integration, line of service application, line of business applications that have been heavily customized, years of sketchy administrative practices. So we have this knot in Active Directory that's very hard for us to unpick. Being able to pull those controls down into the on-premise state through tools like Silverfort gives you a huge advantage, but you have to have a conceptual model that enables you to kind of see identity as one big consuming service, consumed in the way that our end users consume it, rather than carved up into vertical towers. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to the next folks. Jonathan, after you.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that, and I hope everyone can see my screen now. Yeah. Okay. Sophia, can you just let me know if you can see the screen? Because I can't see if you can. Oh, good. Perfect. So thanks, Ben. A lot of really important information and good information. I really also connect with what you're saying about identity as a horizontal plane. That's what we're talking about at Silverfort for many years now, is you can't think of identity as the technology that manages it, but rather as a platform that you need to manage across all the technologies that you have in your stack. So I want to open with this slide regarding Active Directory, which Ben mentioned a lot. I think we all would have hoped or wished that Active Directory would have been gone by now. Believe it or not, Active Directory has been around for 25 years. In an IT world, I don't know how many of you are using any other piece of technology that's 25 years old today. So it's hard to imagine that a lot of our enterprises are still critically bound to Active Directory and the permissions and the groups and the data sets that we are managing there. So it's hard to imagine our organization without it on one hand. On the other hand, it hasn't been updated from a security perspective in a long, long time. So the goal here is to think of identity not as being managed in Active Directory or identity being managed in Entra ID, but how do we manage identity in general for our organization and use the best tools and resources to manage and protect our identities, regardless of where that identity is actually being stored and managed. So I want to kind of take what Ben talked about at the theoretical level and the processes that he had and show how a tool like Silverfort can really help to implement those things relatively easily in an organization. So what Silverfort has is what we call our Unified Identity Protection Platform, which again helps organizations look at identity not as something being stored in Active Directory or something being stored in Entra, but rather as an identity that covers both and that we need to protect them regardless of where they are authenticating. So if we look at a lot of organizations that we talk to, they say, oh, I have MFA, I'm protected. But in reality, when we ask them, okay, what do you have MFA on? So they have MFA for Office 365, or they have MFA for their Salesforce app or Workday or whatever SaaS application it may be, and maybe for RDP or maybe for some other web applications. But when you ask them, okay, what about command line tools, PowerShell, remote PowerShell? Oh, no, there's no way we can put MFA on that. But that's what attackers are using. Attackers aren't really using tools like RDP to move around their network because it makes too much noise. They're using these tools that system admins are using or scripts are using to do their normal function, and the attackers are using those tools as well. And because it's been very difficult up till now to put MFA on those tools, the attacker has just been able to walk right in. Remember, the attacker is not going to go after the most difficult thing to hack. He's going to go after the easiest thing to hack. And Ben also talked about this a little bit as well as the journey to the cloud. I think, again, about 10 years ago, we all thought that most or all organizations would be 100% in the cloud. And unfortunately, that's not true for many reasons. It could be regulations, it could be legacy applications, it could be just a tech debt that that organizations have that they haven't been able to move yet. And we can't bury our heads in the sand and say, okay, 5 more years, everything will be in the cloud and we don't need to worry about on-prem anymore. I think we've all come to the realization that we can't ignore on-premise anymore. Because again, going back to what Ben said, the attacker can start in the cloud and move to on-prem, or they can start on-prem and move to the cloud. They're going to go to where it's easiest for them. And so if the cloud is protected with FIDO tokens and password lists and number matching and all of that, why would the attacker go there if you can use an identity that's on-prem, break into it by getting those credentials off the dark web and no MFA or FIDO, and then use that identity to then access cloud resources? It's much easier for them. It's always important to keep in mind that just like us, normal people that work in enterprises, attackers have budgets and they have bosses, right? They have deadlines that they have to meet. They have to make sure that the attack has a good return on investment. So if we make it difficult for them, they're just going to move on to somebody else. So if we take a bit of a closer look at the MFA blind spot, so we talked about command lines, admin consoles, the hypervisors, file systems like the traditional Microsoft shared folders, legacy applications, network devices. These are all things that attackers are going after because they know that it's very difficult to protect with modern day tools. And I want to just dive a little bit deeper into one of the main ones, which is service accounts. This is something that is so commonly overlooked by organizations. Service accounts, or non-human identities as they're being referred to today. These are those identities that don't belong to a specific user, so there's no onboarding or offboarding process. They're used to run business critical applications. They're running for years and years inside an organization with very high privileges. And this is something that organizations don't even have visibility into what they're doing, let alone the ability to protect it. When I talk to a customer and ask them, do you know what service accounts you have? And they're like, yeah, sure. And they open up an Excel file. I already know that they have no idea, because if you're basing your identity on an Excel file, then you're already behind and the attacker's winning. Who's updating that Excel file? How often is it updated? How do you check that those are the right permissions and groups and users of what that service account should be doing? You can't manage it through an Excel file. So let's talk a little bit about how Silverfort works and how we can help to protect those identities. So if we take a look at a traditional on-prem environment, authentications are going to happen with Active Directory. So if I look here, Silverfort, we're not going to come in. We're not going to make any changes to your users or to your service accounts. We're not going to make changes to your resources. And the only thing we're going to do is we're going to install our service on Active Directory, which doesn't actually affect the Active Directory application. So no effect on support, no effect on upgrades, nothing like that. And what's going to happen is when an authentication hits Active Directory, the same way that's been happening for years and years, 25 years to be exact, this time instead of Active Directory immediately providing a response, it's going to go to Silverfort. And Silverfort is going to run it through our policy engine, and we're going to make a decision. And that decision, in many cases, can be, let's link that to conditional access. So Ben mentioned this in his first slide, where conditional access is that one center pivot point where all decisions are made. And so at Silverfort, we completely agree with that. We need all decisions to be made in one point, because if you have too many strategies, then you're lost. So you want one point where all decisions are being made, and conditional access is a great example of that decision point. So we'll take that on-premise authentication, we'll pass it over to conditional access. From there, you can loop in risk indicators from Defender. You can loop in things from Intune, for example, from a whole wide variety of sources in order to make a decision on what you want to do. That can be to allow the authentication, block it, trigger MFA, and then a wide variety of types of MFAs. But once the user approves, it goes back. But what do we do about service accounts? Obviously, for non-human identities, we can't MFA them. So with Silverfort, what we have is called a virtual fence. We will build in an automated way a virtual fence of what those service accounts are allowed to do. So for example, if it's a service account for an application, so it's supposed to go from the web server to the database, and that's it. Even if it has domain admin privileges, we can make sure that that service account only talks from the web service to the database without affecting anything else in the organization. And finally, we're going to, of course, link everything to Sentinel or to your other SIEM solution. And with Microsoft last week, we released our Sentinel plugin as well as our Security Copilot plugin. So you can actually use natural language processes to ask Silverfort information. What are my risky users? How many users have been blocked with an MFA? How many users have been denied access through a Silverfort policy? And so on and so on. So I'll talk a little bit more about service accounts, because I think that's one of the main challenges that organizations are having today. As I mentioned, they're highly privileged, unknown dependencies. Think about an application that was installed 10 years ago. How many IT people have moved throughout the organization? Who knows if that person that implemented that service is still around? Difficult to protect. A lot of times with other solutions, you have to rotate passwords, you have to vault the passwords, the dependencies becomes very difficult. And they're running with very, very high privileges and misused. Think about developers. They don't want to open a ticket to ask for a new service account. So they use an existing service account, even though they know they're not supposed to, because it has too many privileges. So as a result, as I mentioned, organizations lose complete visibility and control over their service accounts and what those service accounts are doing. Attackers know this, and this is why this is one of the first places they're going when they get into an organization. And it doesn't take a lot of searching on Google to find some great examples. So SolarWinds from a few years ago, Uber and Okta. These breaches, what they have in common is that they were all done using service accounts. So either a credential that was in a script, or the SolarWinds service account itself because it had too many privileges, the Okta, the jump from the on-prem to the cloud environment, all being done with service accounts. Okay, so we know we have a problem with service accounts. What do we need to do about it? So the first thing we need to do is discover. You can't protect what you don't know, right? The unknown unknown. So what Silverfort will help do, and I'll show a little bit of a more in-depth example in just a few seconds, but we provide the discovery capability. So first, let's get a list of all of the service accounts plus their dependencies. So service account A is accessing these 12 different machines. Do I want it to access those 12 machines? That's a good question, which we need to answer, but first we need to know what it's actually doing. Then we need to prioritize. So which service accounts have high risks? Which ones have a broad use, are being used on not 12 servers, but 1,200 servers? And now we can start to build a prioritization list on which service accounts we want to protect first, because obviously we can't do everything on day one. We want to protect the ones that provide the most, that are the most risky. We want to protect those first. And then we want to start to protect. As I mentioned, we call it our virtual fencing. So I want to limit what each service account is actually allowed to do, so that if in the case of an attacker getting hold of it, it's not game over, it's not a complete network takeover, but I am limiting the blast radius of what that service account can actually do in my environment. And finally, the last step, especially in the large organizations, is to automate the process, right? We need speed. If I have 100,000 service accounts in my organization, I can't do it one by one. So with Silverfort, we have the option, we have smart policies that will recommend using our tools how to protect the service accounts based on their history and authentications that have happened up till now. And the other option is to integrate with CMDB tools like ServiceNow, where you have those dependencies laid out, and then you can use those to enforce policies inside of Silverfort. So now let's jump over to a quick demo where we'll see the product features and based on the user's needs, but hopefully in our case, the product features will actually match the user's needs, not in the case of this picture. So first I'll show a quick video of service of protecting PowerShell. So I'll just remove the laser. A quick video here, what we'll see is an admin running a PowerShell script. So it's running a remote connection using PowerShell. And we'll see as soon as we initiate the connection, what's going to happen here in the bottom is you see the sign in with Microsoft button. Once the user clicks sign in with Microsoft, this is conditional access. So think about when you're signing into Office 365 or any other SaaS application, the exact same flow is taking place. The only difference here is that this is an on-prem authentication. So the user is going to click sign in with Microsoft, go through the exact same process. If they had a token that was valid with SSO, then it would skip over this process, obviously, and we can choose which type of MFA we want. In this case, we're going to use non-phishable MFA number matching, which is a very smart decision. Click through it, and now the admin is connected with their PowerShell script, and everything was run through Microsoft, so you have a unified user experience, no matter if it's on-prem or if it's in the cloud. And we'll show one more example here. So a lot of organizations obviously still using SQL Management Studio. We want to be able to protect it with MFA. Obviously very important. We have customer data there. We have GDPR issues and things like that. So I'll connect. As soon as I connect, again, we see here, and this time we're going to use a YubiKey. So we're going to get that option to authenticate. The user is going to be prompted to authenticate with a FIDO token. In this case, we're using YubiKey, but we support any FIDO token. And the user is let in. We did not need to make any changes to the SQL server. Nothing changed on that side. The only thing that we did was implement Silverfort. Excuse me. And now, excuse me, for that live demo, which is always fun, what could go wrong, right? So we'll switch over to my live demo, and you can see here the Silverfort dashboard. And I just want to show you two quick things here. One is around creating a policy. I just want to show you how quick and easy it is to create a policy. So let's say I want to create a policy to protect my banking application. So I know that my banking application is authenticating using Active Directory, and I know it authenticates using Kerberos or maybe NTLM, but it's also very easy to find out. We can show you that in a few minutes as well. I want this to be a static-based policy, meaning it's irrelevant the risk of the user. I want to just keep it very simple for now. So for here, I select my group of users, but let's just take one specific user to keep things very simple. But obviously, I can select OUs or groups. It doesn't matter where the user is connecting from. I want this policy to take place. And I know that my banking app is running on my application server. So I select my application server. I click done. And then what do I want to do? Do I want to prompt for MFA using the Microsoft Authenticator? So this would be just a standard push authentication. Or do I want to bridge it to a different identity provider? So for example, I can select Entra ID here, and then select the enterprise app that is relevant for this on-premise application. The enterprise app is where I will configure things like the type of MFA that should be used. So if I can select here from the dropdown, I can select exactly which enterprise application or which policy, if you think about it like that, which policy in Entra ID do I want this on-premise policy to be connected to? And I click save. That's it. I wait about 30 seconds for the policies to be synced. The next time that my user tries to authenticate to the banking application on this server, it's going to be bridged to Entra ID, to the specific policy that is selected. And from there, the conditional access flow will take over. So it's very, very simple to bring the power of Entra ID to the on-premise environment. And the last thing that I want to show here, just keeping in mind the time, is the service account. So we talked about the human identities where it's, for example, MFA. Let's take a look at the non-human identity. So I'm obviously, I talked about using the smart policies to do things at scale. But just to understand how it works, we're just going to take an example of one specific service account. So here we can see a service account that is called DR Backup. Any guesses as to what it does? I would say it backed up stuff. So we can see here that this service account is accessing from these sources to these destinations. And obviously I can expand it to see more. So me as the system administrator, I can reach out to the backup team and say, does this server, or does this service, excuse me, actually need to authenticate from all of these servers? And they'll tell me, no, 50.20 is the backup server. It should only be running from there. So all I need to do is click here. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, and disallow all of them. I also know that the backup server, or the backup service, excuse me, is running using Kerberos. So why would I ever let it authenticate using NTLM or LDAP? There's a lot of different attack methods that will force Windows to use a less secure authentication method. We don't want to allow that because we know that we should only be using Kerberos. And then all I have to do is, if something is outside of this scope, I want to deny access. Obviously, I want to be send that information to the SIM. I want to get notified, and that's it. I click save, wait a few seconds for the policy to sync, and that's it. I'm now protecting this service account. Notice I didn't need to rotate a password. I didn't need to vault a password. I didn't need to make any changes to the backup service. Everything is happening automatically. The final thing, I know I said that this was the final thing, but I'll just mention one more thing, and that's around the insights. So up till now, we've been talking about how to actively protect. So think about ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response. So we've been talking a lot about the response capabilities, but the detection is also super important. So in Silverfort, we have what are called insights. And by the way, all of this is being shared with your SIM solution or Sentinel, for example. So we can see here, for example, I have 350 users. Of those users, I have 140 domain admins. I'm assuming that's probably not the best practice for my organization. I have shadow admins. An example of a shadow admin is a user that has the ability to reset a domain admin, but they themselves are not a domain admin, which in one step makes them a domain admin. Same thing for Azure. Users, privileged users, users with password never expires, and so on and so on. And we can see risky users. For example, my user is at a very high risk, and I can dive down in and investigate why this user is at a high risk, and so on. So we're focusing on the detection, but we're also focusing on the response capabilities. So that's my quick demo. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to pass. Yeah, we can see your screen, Jason. You're muted.
Yep, mute button claims yet another victim.
There you
Thank you
go.
very much. Excellent. Yeah. So continuing on the theme, the way that we like to talk about identity at ITC is we tend to go right the way back to first principles. So I'll skip over the first point. Every identity solution is unique. Nobody does identity the same way. Even down to usage of fields in Active Directory or Entra, which other services are involved. People are still using LDAP, so people have got RACF floating about. You know, there's all sorts of things thrown into the mix, particularly in the hybrid world where there wasn't quite as many good standards available. A good solution is a journey. If you think about the way that Entra has evolved, I'm not saying anything about the continual name changes, but if we think about the way that new features are continually coming in, the difference today in the permissions and the protections available within an Entra world, cloud first world, are light years ahead of where they were a year, 2 years, 5 years ago. And I think this third point is the one I really want to call attention to with Silverfort, in that the identity, security, and enablement are inextricably woven together. And the reason we focus on this is we want to make it easy for our end users to come along with us, to comply, to agree with the policy. So the benefit of using Entra is it's a nice, straightforward, standard approach. Once you're used to it, it's it's a background thing. And this is also where Silverfort really plays into that. If I'm going to protect an on-premise MFA, I'm not suddenly running around looking for an RSA token in the back of the drawer, the way that I used to have to do. I'm using the same multi-factor and the same controls and the same identity, and I'm getting a very, very similar experience to my cloud world. So 90% of the time I'm checking emails, I'm working in documents, I'm doing day-to-day jobs. Once in a while I'll need to go on to a server and make a change. I'll need to elevate, I'll need to conduct a multi-factor, but it's the same experience. And the other key thing here is that's very end user focused. We also need to keep in mind that these systems need to be relatively straightforward for us to live with, as well as practitioners, system owners, the protectors. The quote on one of Jonathan's slides about PAM rollouts. PAM as a technology is relatively straightforward. It's the business intelligence, it's the technical intelligence needed. Who owns that service account? Who can make a decision about the service account? Who can make a decision about whether somebody is entitled to access a piece of software? All of these things are complicated. So being able to put something in which lets me sidestep those issues, I don't need to go into a 2-year business analysis project to do a 2-week technical rollout, which can happen in those big PAM rollouts. So again, playing into both the comments from Ben and Jonathan, we tend to take a very identity-centric view of things. You have an identity, and the identity might actually be made of multiple accounts, but the accounts are subsumed into the identity. I have a user account in various end systems, but it's my identity. And what we're looking to do at ITC with identity is want to make sure that the right actors, and I say actors because obviously we've got service accounts, other non-human actors, have the right access to the right resources at the right time for the right reasons. And this is, again, bringing in all the resources from Entra. We want the attestation, we want the access packages, we want to make sure that I am who I claim to be, and that at the right time, I can do that just-in-time validation to make sure that I am entitled to do this. I can do this. It's easier in the cloud. Obviously, we've got the ability to use services like PIM and dynamically elevate into permission sets. I don't need to be a global admin 9 to 5, but for those 3 tasks a month, great. I can elevate into that. If I'm a domain admin on Active Directory, it's a lot more challenging. But using the tools like Silverfort, again, I can ring fence that to be able to make sure that the tasks that I need to do are still being protected. And the fact that I've got that elevated permission that I don't actually need, it's not in mundane use. So getting started with Silverfort, actually relatively straightforward. Speak to us. We'll arrange a kickoff call with you. We'll introduce ourselves. We'll introduce Silverfort. We will discuss your success criteria. What is it that you're looking to do? What is your particular need for Silverfort? For some people, that might be MFA for privileged users. For some people, that will be service accounts. For some people, it'll be everything. And that's great. But we want to make sure that we are solving the right problem for you. Again, it's that your identity needs are unique to you. We want to be respectful of that. We'll run through some prereqs, which aren't particularly onerous, get some key details about the environment, so we're making sure that we're not providing you with the Hyper-V images if you're a VMware user, that sort of thing. And then what we'll do is we'll schedule in a proof of concept. Proof of concept takes about 2 weeks. These are really, really valuable because these are deployed into your environments. We can deploy it into your production. We can deploy it into a lab. That's fine. That's your world. We work with you. And this gives us the ability to learn more about what's going on in your environment. Now, it's quite quick to deploy in a lab environment in particular. We certainly deployed it in about 2 or 3 hours at ITC. At which point it was active, it was generating intelligence, and we were building policies. In larger and more complex environments, it will take a little bit longer. But this is how we discover what it's going to take. And this gives us some really useful information about what the production rollout is likely to be like. Effectively, we're finding out in advance before it becomes critical what's going to be involved. We'll watch the Silver Fort with you, and then over the course of a couple of weeks, we'll implement some policies. We'll work with you. We'll come back to you. This is very much a collaboration where we don't just throw the product over the wall to you and go, there you go, chaps, we'll see you in a fortnight. This is one of those things where we will be working with you all the way across this POC to make sure that you are seeing the things that you need to see, any issues, any questions. And what we frequently find during this is, because of the information that is surfaced, it does lead to rabbit holes. Right, let's go and have a look over here now, because all of a sudden we've spotted this interesting thing that we weren't aware of. The visibility that you gain from putting Silver Fort in by itself is really, really valuable. And then obviously we'll review that. And then hopefully, once you've seen it in situ, you've experienced it, you know what it's going to be like to live with, then you'll be very keen to move it to production. That's our hope, at least. And then taking all the lessons that we've learned, what's CAD processes going to be like, how many domains we're going to need to involve, all of these things, then we can build the rollout plan and we can get that into production for you. But we can do that in a staged, managed approach. Now, obviously, ITC, we're big fans of Silver Fort, but we have our own identity services on top. One of the things that we find Silver Fort really, really supports brilliantly is something we would call an identity health check, where we come in, we look at your identity. It's very, very Active Directory focused, and we pull it apart and see what's in there. Now, Silver Fort is very authentication focused. So if you've got service accounts which aren't doing much, they'll show up eventually, depending on when they've authenticated. But what we want to do is we want to get in there and actually have a look. And we go in looking for things like stale users, overprivileged accounts, orphans. This is where we discover things like unexpected SQL servers that are running as domain admin. That one's worryingly common still. We've found things like where people's previous outsource partner have still got 100 domain admin accounts active on the account, on the estate. Things like this, which are useful for you to know, because then you can find out about them from a friendly person rather than an attacker coming in and exploiting it. Similarly, because we're getting more information about your domain, how you're using it, that then allows us to make more helpful comments into the broader identity. Identity is one of those things. 20 years ago, it was just accounts and account management. Group management was creeping in. Today, it's holistic. Your identity covers so much of the business that you can't move for. Everything is an identity problem. And that's the reason why, obviously, we can help you with, if you need it, identity lifecycle management, RBAC, governance, entitlement management. We also run a maturity assessment where we'll look at your approach to identity. But again, it's all about visibility. It's all about making sure that the information that you're getting is useful, valuable, and actually allows you to make informed choices about what you might need or might want to do next. So hopefully that's of use. And I think back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, so Thank you for all of that, gentlemen. I've just got a couple of questions. I think actually, Ben, I was going to point it to you, but I think you actually got ahead of there and answered it. But maybe for those that haven't read, you talked obviously about, and today it's very much been about identity being a holistic plane across the business, not necessarily set on technology. The question was more about, let's assume a business is set on that path. What were the issues that you have commonly seen in preventing a business from getting to that point? Could you maybe touch on that? And again, anyone else want to chip in, then feel free.
Yeah, I mean, technically speaking, you've always got the kind of usual suspects of like different identity providers, because large banks, large organizations, they'll have more than one identity provider. Traditional AD or Entra ID might be their primary, but there'll be others for mainframe or things like that. So from a technical perspective, you have complexity around stitching those together. You want to manage them in a more sort of cohesive way. But I think actually the biggest challenges are not actually technical. They have more to do with it. So if you're an organization that to this point has kind of carved identity up into verticals built around tooling and technology towers, your biggest challenge is cultural. And it's a leadership challenge and it's a management challenge. It's really about how do you get those stakeholders who will have defined budget, strategy, metrics to assess their performance that their bosses are looking at. Those will all be aligned to those towers. That has to change. So you may still keep, I'm not talking about just redrawing lines on the org chart. You may still keep different teams focused on different technology stacks because the skills to manage traditional AD, for example, is fundamentally different from the skills, the protocols, the authentication methods used in Entra ID. So you may have teams separate in that sense, but cross-functional teams that are stitching together identity in this sort of cohesive end-to-end way, metrics, assessments of business impact rather than just random technology sort of metrics that are being used to assess the system currently. Those are really key. I think one way to get support from stakeholders who are used to kind of running their own sort of little silos and fiefdoms is articulate it in the context of how it's going to enable your business. Because a lot of the pressure that CISOs are under now in security organizations is not coming from security. It's coming from the rest of their organization coming back to them and saying, our experience of your services, or the CIO's team, if they're the ones providing identity, our experience of your services makes us dysfunctional when we're in the field. We need this to be less friction. We need to be enabled where we are. So if you can articulate how joining up identity in a more cohesive way is not only going to make you more secure, it's going to actually enable your business and lower friction around your end users, you will find many people that would otherwise get in your way that will go out of their way to be supportive of the changes you might propose.
Yeah, and just reiterating a little bit, I think moving away from that account and that technology focus to a more holistic identity, because we haven't even touched on people coming in, so we haven't touched at external users, partners, B2B, B2C, self-sovereign or verified identities. Identity itself is something that we need to be able to separate from the technical implementation and actually just go, we know who that actor is, and that actor may have multiple accounts, but we can, looking across our domains, still produce a cohesive view of who that individual is, what they are potentially, and what they have access to be able to do, and who's looking after that. Who is the authority behind that? Is that HR because they're a real person? Is that a business owner? Is that a service stream? Is that still relevant? So we can still make sure that these things are owned, attested, and accountable.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jason. So just another question. I think, Jonathan, you mentioned certainly, I think that one of the slides was around insurance companies. Certainly in ITC, we've seen a trend that definitely in the US, but I get the question was, how often now are you seeing insurance companies mandate sort of comprehensive, holistic MFA in order for them to get covered? Do you see this increasing? Is this a global trend? Is it driven? Question.
Definitely. First of all, great question. Second of all, definitely a global trend. And insurance companies are becoming much more specific on what they're requiring. So you'll see things around service account protection, and they'll require you to do an audit that shows that you're protecting service accounts. It's not enough just to rotate a password every 6 months or 7 months. For admins, it needs to protect everything. Any privileged user, you need to protect with MFA for everything, and they're even specifying what type of MFA. So unphishable MFA is becoming a thing. FIDO tokens, they're using specific terms like that. And even the term privilege account is becoming broadened. It's not just my IT users or domain admins. It's my CEO, it's my CFO. So even the term privileged users is becoming much broader. Obviously, insurance companies love to play around with wording. It has nothing to do with IT insurance or cyber insurance. It has to do with insurance in general. So that it's going wider because they're just basically sick of paying customers on every time that there's a cyber attack. So they're trying to cover themselves, and they're saying we won't protect you, or it will cost you so much money that you might as well. It'll be cheaper to implement, for example, Silverfort or conditional access than it will be to actually pay for the cyber insurance. And they'll say if you implement these sets of products, will actually reduce your price by so and so. So yeah, it's a global trend, and we're seeing it everywhere. And I think it's just going to be more and more as the attacks just keep getting stronger and stronger.
Okay, thank you. And just a few minutes ago, a question came in, so I'll stay with you, Jonathan. And I guess again, it comes down to the multiple technologies out there, and I guess a level of fusion. How do you move forward? But what if a business is already using a PAM solution like CyberArk? Is there still a need for Silverfort?
Yeah, good question. So one, I think everybody in the security industry will agree that it's not one product. You can't buy one product or one platform and be protected for everything. It's really a team sport. It's layering like an onion, all the different layers of protection. CyberArk is a great tool, a great company. By the way, I worked there for 7 years, so near and dear. But it can't do everything, and there's definitely ways around CyberArk, right? It's the user experience. Users, at the end of the day, users are lazy. They'll find the quickest and easiest way around. And we've seen lots of organizations where they've implemented and spent years and tons of money implementing CyberArk, only to see that users are circumventing the system. They're copying passwords, writing them down until the next rotation, and connecting directly. They're skipping over the session isolation servers in PAM solutions and getting around it. So one, a solution like Silverfort can make sure that you can't do that because of the way that we are architectured and the way that we see every authentication. We can guarantee that a user has to go through CyberArk in order to be connected. And the second thing is service accounts. CyberArk is a great tool for the human users of all types. It's not really a great solution for service accounts, and having to vault service accounts as well as dependencies of service accounts is not something that I've ever seen successfully done. And so that's, I think, is a great place also where Silverfort can come in and help complement an existing PAM solution.
I think that's an important point, because if you look at Sean Metcalf and some of his material, lots of other folks talking about, how you compromise, for example, traditional Active Directory, the top bullet on those slides is, it doesn't matter what fancy PAM solution they have, they can't protect their service accounts. I know some organizations that haven't changed service account passwords in 10, 15 years because they don't know what will break if they do. And an advantage of a solution like Silverfort is you don't have to change the passwords, right? So this is a very important thing. And the other thing I would add to that before we wrap up is a tool like a password vault versus just-in-time access versus something like a clean keyboard, like a privileged access workstation. Those all three address different risks. They're not synonyms for one another. They all address different risks at different points in time. They're all important, but they're all important for different reasons. So just make sure that you don't fall victim to this kind of silver bullet mentality, which sometimes follows technical tools and PAM tools in particular. It's the layering and the way that you're intentionally putting them together to address risk that matters most.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jonathan. We're pretty much, I want to make sure that we stay on time, so we're coming to a conclusion there. To stay with the onion analogy, Jonathan, hopefully the problem with an onion is you can peel it, but it often keeps making you cry. And really, I guess today, hopefully, we've been able to try and reduce a little bit of that. And certainly, look, we'll be following up with each via email to offer a one-to-one session with experts from ITC, Silverfort, etc., Microsoft to support you. We know that sometimes the end goal, it's clear we want to get there. It's not always an easy path. in untangling what's there to get to that endpoint. And again, to use Ben's parlance, there's not always a silver bullet to do that. So look, thank you very much for joining today. I hope you found it useful, and we will reach out to you in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers all.
Bye.